Welcome back to the Introduction to React series. In this second video we'll talk about React elements and JSX. The simple component we created in the previous video was just a function that returned some JSX. You might wonder, how exactly does React render this? React uses a lightweight representation of the rendering tree, and the nodes in that structure are called React elements. A React element is a JavaScript object with two properties, type and props. An element can represent both a DOM node or a custom React component. If the element is a DOM node, its type property will be a string. If the React element is a component, its type property will be a reference to the React component. That's usually just a JavaScript function. The second property of the element is called props, and it's an object. If the element is a DOM node, the props object contains all attributes of the node. If the element is a React component, props contains all custom props of the element. For both DOM nodes and React components, the props object also has the children property. It contains all child nodes, React components, or text nodes of the element. Internally, React uses this object-based, lightweight representation of the DOM in the form of elements in order to render the complete user interface. The elements are in a tree data structure linked by the children property of each element. Elements allow mixing standard DOM nodes with custom components in the user interface. React has to go through all elements in order to render them. When the algorithm reaches an element, it can determine if it represents a DOM node or a React component by checking if the type property is a class or a function. If it is, it represents a component, and React can ask it which elements should it render in its place. This internal process is called the React reconciliation algorithm. React elements allow performant rendering. Rendering happens multiple times in a single page application. React elements are simple objects, which means traversing them is much cheaper than traversing the DOM. This allows React to compare diffs and only render changes to the UI, rather than the entire user interface. Most importantly, this happens without any input from the developer. As a React developer, you would never see React elements as objects in your code, as they're completely abstracted away by JSX. As I briefly mentioned in the previous video, JSX stands for JavaScript XML. During compilation, JSX is transformed to React elements, which is why it supports both DOM nodes and custom React components. The tag name corresponds to the type of the element object. Each XML attribute is passed to the props object, and the child elements inside the XML tag are passed in the props children property. JSX needs to be compiled, which usually happens with Babel or the TypeScript compiler. When compiled, it is just transformed to React elements. In older versions of React, the compilers used the internal React createElement function. It is used to generate a React element with parameters. Babel would just convert the JSX to React createElement calls, and that worked fine, with one drawback. React has to be defined. This means that the developer needed to import React every time he used JSX. This is no longer the case now. Since React 17, compilers don't depend on this internal implementation, so you don't need to import React every time you use JSX. Have this in mind if you read older code or watch tutorials released before React 17. So far we have talked only about elements, but JSX also supports JavaScript expressions. To write JavaScript, just open and close a curly brace. Everything between the curly braces is a JavaScript expression. You can also return a value here, and it will be evaluated in place. In order to render a return value, it should be a string or a React element. This allows us to render any JavaScript value within an element. Another use case for expressions within JSX is to output lists as elements. Let's say we have an array with some data. This happens frequently when React applications receive data from a server and need to render it to the user in some form. To do this, we can simply open the curly braces and iterate through the array. You will usually use map as you want to transform a data value to an element. In this case, we take this object and transform it to a list item DOM node. One important peculiarity here is that when rendering lists, you have to add a key prop to each element that is rendered. That key should be a unique identifier of the element. React will use the key to identify the items in order to render any changes that happen to them efficiently. Now that we have rendered a list, how do we apply styles to it? JSX supports multiple ways to style elements. First, you can import CSS files when using the appropriate bundler. In this case, we are using Create React App, which uses Webpack internally. We can import a CSS file and all of the class names defined in it will work here. But how do we assign the class to a React element? You might think you just use the class attribute like you do in HTML and the class will work, but that's not correct. JSX is very close to HTML, but it doesn't support all attributes with the same syntax. The class keyword is reserved in JavaScript for class definition, so the workaround in JSX is to use the class name attribute. This does turn away beginners at first, because it seems like they need to learn another variation of HTML to use JSX, but these differences are very few and very close to their HTML equivalents. Now that I applied my class, the styles from my imported CSS work. This is one way to use styles. You can also write styles inline. The style attribute is available just like in HTML. The difference is that it accepts an object rather than a string. You then write your CSS rules in the JavaScript object. The rules that have a dash like margin bottom are written in camel case. Because this is an object, you can also write it anywhere in the module or even import it from another file. In addition, there are many different libraries with different approaches to apply styles to React elements. This wraps today's video. We talked about elements and JSX. In the next video, I plan to talk about the concept of components. Stay tuned.